Will you pray with me? God of all our hosannas, we add ours this day, asking that they be received in the spirit that they are offered, laying ourselves down at your feet in prayer and in praise. Amen. He had watched the authorities fear them, police them, send troops to peaceful gatherings just to make sure nothing happened. He had heard his people cry out and watched them get impatient, angry, chanting together for justice, for their freedom more and more frequently. A conflict is coming, was already there. He could feel it, more violent than what they had seen for a long time. So the next time he drew near and heard that militaristic music, saw that flag waving, he knew what he had to do, and so he did it. As others lined up to honor the nation as they had always done, he took a knee. While the anthem played, Colin Kaepernick knelt before the flag. In 1957, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. developed a single sermon on the topic of loving your neighbors, loving your enemies. It was as long as this entire series we have been doing over the past 5 weeks. 7,000 words. He talked about the why, that hate can't drive out hate, but spreads like a cancer within us, causing neuroses. He talked about the how, analyzing the self first, not only because once you find your own flaws, it's easier to find the good in another and see them as made in the image of God, but also because you might just discover something in yourself that is provoking this conflict too. Indeed, we are reminded that Jesus' worst criticism was for what others deemed his own side, crying out to the temple authorities that they were making a holy place into a shopping center and a den of thieves. So this self and other discovery is what we discussed when we discussed forgiveness. If you can find the good in them, the God in them, it is easier to love them in spite of them or in spite of yourself. Lastly, King discusses that one must never take the opportunity offered to defeat one's enemy, and he says it will always come. But never take the opportunity to defeat one's enemy, because every opportunity you are offered to win is also an opportunity to transform and thereby redeem. And so, as he looked out over the coming revolution, he saw, as he called it, there were 3 options a person could take. Violence. If chosen, that would mean an unborn generation would be the recipient of a long and desolate night of bitterness, and our chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. So I think that one was out. 2, giving in. But this, he argues, is in some sense a cooperation with evil. To do nothing is to side with the oppressor. And so he reaches his 3rd option, nonviolent, resistant love. You place yourself on common ground, as we discussed last week, and you love. But you do not give up your understanding of right and wrong. Judgment is your understanding of right and wrong, not the condemnation of someone else's. That's perhaps the key, because this is not love to win. This is love to transform that we have been talking about. Yourself and the other in front of you. You transform yourself by refusing to give in, by refusing to bow down to policies and principles that are wrong, by refusing to be irreparably wounded by the pandemic of moral trauma. You do not give in to wrong and simply let it go, but you do not let it rot your core. You transform yourself by holding on to the right that is based in love. We are not called to give up our judgment, but to hold on to it in love. And you transform the other the same way, by wearing them down with love, by showing up on common ground, taking a knee, taking a seat at the counter, taking a cross as it comes before you. As King said, that's why Jesus says, love your enemies, because if you hate your enemies, you have no way to redeem and transform. But if you love your enemies, you will discover that at the very root of love is the power of redemption. You just keep loving people and keep loving them and keep loving them, even though they're mistreating you. Here's the person who is a neighbor, and this person is doing something wrong to you and all of that. Just keep being friendly to that person, he says. Keep loving them. Don't do anything to embarrass them. Just keep loving them, and they can't stand it. Just keep loving them. They react in many ways. At the beginning, they react with bitterness because they're mad that you love them like that. They react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more at that transition period, but you keep loving them. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. That's love. It is redemptive. You see, Jesus came and he did not shout obscenities. He did the equivalent of taking a knee. He refused to bow down to the Roman authorities. He refused to join their parade and draw attention to their violence. No, he refused to hate them as well. He showed up that day, and he showed up with love, intolerable as it was, refusing to be baited into systems of violence, but trusting that if he showed up with nothing less than complete love, they would be transformed. Now, this series was originally designed to answer the question, how do I learn to trust again? After 2016, 2020, the pandemic of moral injury, how do I trust my neighbor again? How do I do it? But I'm not sure here, standing at the end of this series, that it is our neighbor, in fact, that we have to trust. It is love. There have always been, and there will always be, those who oppress and ignore, who choose ignorance or violence. 20 centuries past, it was the same. And yet, it is love that we learn to trust, because we have seen that even as hate does its very worst, crucifying goodness itself, love will win in the end. So if you need a way to wrap up this series, friends, well, this week, come and see that in love we can trust and overcome.